This story was submitted by a man we'll call Harold. And it starts 4 days after he buried his wife. Her name was Margaret. They were married for 41 years. She died on a Tuesday in November after 14 months with pancreatic cancer. The funeral was on Friday. 67 people came. Harold stood at the front of the church in a suit Margaret had picked out for him 11 years earlier and accepted handshakes and half-hugs from people whose faces he could barely register because grief does that. It puts a film over everything, like looking at the world through a window that hasn't been cleaned. He went home afterward. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet before, not peaceful quiet, but subtracted quiet. The kind of quiet that exists when a sound you've heard every day for 4 decades just stops. He sat in his chair. He didn't eat. He didn't turn on the television. He just sat. On Sunday, 4 days after the funeral, his son arrived. Derek, 43 years old, drove in from Calgary with his wife, Pamela. Harold heard the car pull into the driveway. He heard the front door open. He expected, well, he wasn't sure what he expected. Maybe a hug. Maybe a casserole. Maybe his son sitting across from him and saying, "Dad, how are you holding up?" That's not what happened. What happened was this: Harold was in the kitchen making tea when he heard the sound of a measuring tape in the living room. The metallic click of the lock. The hiss of the blade extending. Then Pamela's voice, not loud but not whispering either, saying, "If we take out this wall, it opens up the whole main floor. That adds at least 40. Harold walked to the doorway. Derek was holding one end of the tape against the baseboard. Pamela was at the other end, typing numbers into her phone. They had moved Margaret's reading chair to get a clear line across the room. Margaret's chair. The one with the blue cushion she'd recovered herself. The one that still had her glasses on the side table next to it. They had moved it. Harold stood in the doorway and watched. And then Derek noticed him. Derek didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He straightened up, retracted the tape, and said, casually, conversationally, like he was discussing the weather, "Hey, Dad. Pam and I were just talking about what makes sense for the house. We think you should look at Lakeview Pines. It's a nice community. Assisted living. You wouldn't have to worry about maintaining this place. Lakeview Pines." Harold knew it. A retirement facility on the edge of town. Clean. Institutional. The kind of place with handrails in every hallway and activities calendars posted on corkboards and a faint smell of disinfectant that no amount of potpourri could fully cover. His wife had been in the ground for 96 hours, and his son was measuring the living room and pitching him a nursing home. Harold told me he didn't say anything. Not because he was weak. Because he was reading the room. He was looking at his son and his daughter-in-law standing in his living room with a measuring tape and a real estate calculator, and he was understanding something about the situation that would take Derek months to realize Harold had understood in that moment. He said, "I'll think about it." 3 words. Calm. Non-committal. Then he went back to the kitchen and finished making his tea. And while the water boiled, Harold made 2 decisions. The first was that he would not be going to Lakeview Pines. The second was that he needed to check the bank accounts. Harold and Margaret had maintained their finances simply. 1 joint checking account. 1 joint savings account. A modest investment portfolio managed by a financial advisor they'd used for 20 years. Margaret's pension from her years as a school librarian. Harold's pension from the Auto Workers Union. The house, which was paid off. And 1 other asset, which I'll get to shortly. The savings account was the primary reserve. It held the bulk of their liquid wealth, money accumulated over decades of living below their means. Margaret had been particularly disciplined about it. She tracked every deposit, every withdrawal, every transfer. She kept a handwritten ledger in a notebook in the kitchen drawer, old-fashioned, yes, but complete and accurate to the penny. On Monday morning, Harold sat down at the kitchen table with Margaret's ledger, his laptop, and a cup of coffee that went cold before he touched it. The savings account should have held approximately $212,000. That was the last figure Margaret had entered in the ledger, dated 6 weeks before her death, when she was still lucid enough to manage the books. The current balance, according to the online banking portal, was $144,800. $67,200 was missing. Harold checked the transaction history. The money had been withdrawn in a series of electronic transfers over a 5-week period, starting 9 days before Margaret died and continuing through the week after the funeral. 6 transfers in total. Amounts ranging from $8,000 to $14,000. Each one routed to an external account Harold didn't recognize. He didn't panic. He told me the number registered not as a shock but as a confirmation, like a diagnosis you suspected but hadn't yet received. He'd felt something was off. He just hadn't had the bandwidth to look while Margaret was dying. Now he looked. Harold wasn't a technical man. He was 71 years old. He'd worked in an auto plant for 34 years. He could rebuild a carburetor, not a spreadsheet. But he had one advantage that Derek apparently hadn't considered: Harold's nephew. Owen. 31 years old. A paralegal at a firm in Hamilton that handled estates, wills, and civil litigation. Owen was Margaret's great-nephew, her sister's grandson, and he had been close to both Harold and Margaret his entire life. He visited regularly. He called on Sundays. He'd been at the hospital during Margaret's last week, sitting in the corner of the room reading to her when she could no longer read to herself. Owen was the one Harold called. Not the police. Not the bank. Not yet. Owen. Owen drove out the following Saturday. He sat at Harold's kitchen table, looked at the transaction records, and went quiet for about 30 seconds. Then he said, "Uncle Harold, I need to pull the IP logs on these transfers. Can I log into the banking portal from your computer?" Harold slid the laptop across the table. Now, IP logs. For those who don't know, every time someone accesses an online banking system, the login is recorded with an IP address, a unique numerical identifier tied to the internet connection used. It doesn't give you a person's name directly, but it gives you a location. It tells you where the access originated. Owen pulled the access logs for the savings account going back 90 days. He cross-referenced the timestamps of the 6 unauthorized transfers with the IP addresses recorded at the time of each login. Every single transfer had been initiated from the same IP address. And that IP address, when Owen ran a geolocation lookup, resolved to a residential internet service provider in Calgary, Alberta. Derek City. Owen ran a second check. He pulled the account's list of authorized users. Margaret and Harold were the primary holders. But 18 months earlier, a secondary account holder had been added, someone with view and transfer privileges. The name on the authorization was Derek's. Margaret had added him. She'd done it during a period when she was already experiencing early symptoms: fatigue, weight loss, the beginning of what would become her diagnosis. She'd likely added Derek as a practical measure, in case something happened to her and Harold needed help managing the accounts. Derek had used that access to drain $67,000 from his dying mother's savings while she was in palliative care. Owen didn't editorialize. He's a paralegal. He deals in facts. He printed the IP logs, the transfer records, and the authorized user documentation. He put them in a folder. He looked at Harold and said, "What do you want to do?" Harold said, "Not yet. There's something else I need to tell you first." 3 days after Owen's visit, Harold drove 45 minutes to the office of a woman named Barbara Finch. Barbara was a lawyer. She had been Harold and Margaret's lawyer for over 20 years. She'd handled their wills, their power of attorney documents, their property transfers. She was the kind of small-town attorney who kept client files in steel cabinets and remembered birthdays and attended funerals not because it was good for business but because she meant it. Barbara already knew why Harold was coming. Because Margaret had told her. 7 months before she died, while she was still mobile, still sharp, still capable of signing legal documents with full testamentary capacity, Margaret had come to Barbara's office alone. Without Harold. Without Derek. Without telling anyone. And she had updated her will. The original will was straightforward. Everything split evenly between Harold and Derek, with standard survivorship provisions. If Harold passed first, Derek got the house and the accounts. If Margaret passed first, Harold retained everything, with Derek as the residual beneficiary. Boilerplate family estate planning. The updated will was different. Margaret had changed one critical provision. She had added an asset that was not in the original will, an asset that Derek didn't know existed and that Harold himself had almost forgotten about. 22 years earlier, Margaret's aunt, a retired schoolteacher who had never married, had died and left Margaret a small property, a cabin on the Bruce Peninsula, near Tobermory, Ontario. 2 bedrooms. 1,200 square feet. Sitting on a 1-acre lot backing onto a wooded ridge, with a partial view of Georgian Bay through the tree line. At the time, the cabin was worth very little. The area was rural, the property was modest, and Margaret and Harold had visited it maybe twice before deciding it was too far from their daily life to use regularly. They kept it. They paid the property taxes, a few $100s a year. They had a local handyman check on it seasonally. But it sat, essentially, as a dormant line item in their financial life. What neither Harold nor Derek had tracked, but what Margaret, with her librarian's instinct for quiet research, had been watching, was the real estate market on the Bruce Peninsula. Over 2 decades, the area around Tobermory had appreciated significantly. Waterfront and near waterfront properties had tripled and quadrupled in value. The cabin, which had been worth perhaps $60,000 when Margaret inherited it, was now worth approximately $340,000. And Margaret had paid off any remaining costs years ago. The property was owned free and clear. No mortgage. No liens. No encumbrances. In her updated will, Margaret specified that the Tobermory cabin was to pass directly and solely to Harold, outside of the residual estate, with a specific clause stating that the property was not subject to division, distribution, or claim by any other beneficiary. She had written a letter to accompany the will. Barbara gave it to Harold in a sealed envelope. Harold told me he read it in the car, in Barbara's parking lot, with the engine off and the windows up. The letter was short. Margaret's handwriting. Small, precise, the penmanship of a woman who had spent 30 years organizing card catalogs. She wrote that she had added Derek to the bank account because she wanted to make things easier if she became incapacitated. She wrote that she hoped he would use the access responsibly. But she also wrote, and this is the line Harold recited to me from memory, if he doesn't, the cabin is yours. It's paid for. It's quiet. And it's far enough away. She knew. She didn't have proof, she didn't have IP logs or transfer records. But she knew her son. She knew his wife. She knew the measuring tape was coming. And she built a lifeboat for Harold and hid it in a will that nobody else had read. Barbara confirmed that the updated will was properly executed, witnessed, notarized, filed with the court. It would supersede the original will in probate. The cabin was Harold's. Legally, cleanly, and irrevocably. Harold sat in Barbara's office for a long time after she explained all of this. He told me he wasn't thinking about Derek or the money. He was thinking about Margaret. About the fact that she had driven to this office alone, 7 months before she died, already knowing she was dying, and spent her energy not on grief but on protection. On making sure Harold had somewhere to go when the house stopped being safe. He asked Barbara one question, "Can I move there without telling anyone?" Barbara said, "It's your property. You can do whatever you want. And right here, I want to ask you something. If you knew your own blood was measuring your floors before the body was cold, planning the sale, pricing the renovations, picking out your nursing home, would you let them have the keys? Would you hand over the house you shared with the woman who loved you enough to hide a lifeboat in her will? Subscribe if you protect your peace. And I'll tell you how Harold disappeared. Harold spent 3 weeks executing the quietest relocation you've ever heard of. He didn't hire a moving company. He didn't rent a truck with a logo on the side. He borrowed Owen's pickup and made the drive to Tobermory 4 times over 21 days, each time with the bed loaded carefully with what mattered: Margaret's books, her quilts, the kitchen table they'd eaten breakfast at for 30 years, photographs, the blue reading chair, his tools, his clothes, his union pension paperwork. A box of letters Margaret had written him during the 3 years he'd worked a contract in Thunder Bay in the 80s. He took nothing that belonged to Derek. He took nothing that was in dispute. He took only what was his and what was hers, and what was hers was now his, by the terms of a will Derek didn't know had been rewritten. The cabin needed work. The roof was sound, the handyman had replaced shingles 2 years prior, but the interior was dated. Harold didn't care. He cleaned. He repaired. He installed a new wood stove. He stocked the pantry. He put Margaret's chair by the window that faced the trees and the gray line of Georgian Bay beyond them. Owen helped on weekends. He drove up twice, once to help move the heavier furniture and once to install a new deadbolt on the front door and set up internet service so Harold could manage his banking and pension deposits remotely. During this entire 3-week period, Derek called Harold exactly twice. Both times, the conversation was short. The first time, Derek asked if Harold had given any more thought to Lakeview Pines. Harold said he was still considering it. The second time, Derek asked about the house, specifically, whether Harold would be open to listing it in the spring, maybe April, to catch the market. Harold said he'd think about it. He didn't tell Derek he was leaving. He didn't tell Derek about the cabin. He didn't tell Derek about the IP logs, the bank records, the forensic folder Owen had assembled, or the updated will. He just said, "I'll think about it," and let Derek hear what Derek wanted to hear, which was compliance. On the 22nd day, Harold walked through the house one last time. Every room. Every hallway. He stood in the bedroom where Margaret had slept for 41 years. He stood in the kitchen where she'd kept her ledger. He touched the counter where she used to set her coffee cup, always the same spot, always the left side of the sink. Then he locked the front door, drove to the post office, and filed a change of address form. He forwarded his mail to a P.O. box in Tobermory. He did not forward it to Derek. April arrived. Derek called on the second Saturday of the month. Confident. Upbeat. He told Harold he'd spoken with a real estate agent in town, someone Pamela had found online, and that they were ready to get the ball rolling on listing the house. He said they could probably get $450, maybe $475 if they did the renovation Pamela had sketched out. He said he'd come down the following weekend to start getting things ready. Harold let him finish. Then he said, "The house is empty, Derek." Silence. "I moved out 3 weeks ago. I've changed the locks. My forwarding address is not something you need to have." More silence. Then Derek said, and Harold recalled this precisely, "What do you mean you moved out?" "Moved where?" Harold said, "To a property your mother left me. In her will. The updated one." Derek's voice changed. The confidence was gone. What replaced it was something tight and fast, like a man recalculating mid-sentence. "What updated will?" "There's one will. I've seen it. Everything goes through probate, Anne. Your mother updated her will 7 months before she died. Separately. With Barbara Finch. The cabin in Tobermory passes directly to me. It's not part of the residual estate. It's not subject to probate. It's mine." Harold paused. And then he delivered the second piece. I also know about the $67,000, Derek. Nothing. I have the IP logs from the bank. Every transfer. Every timestamp. Every login. All from your IP address in Calgary. You were named as a secondary account holder 18 months ago. Your mother added you because she trusted you. You used that access to steal from her savings while she was in palliative care. Harold told me the line went so quiet he thought Derek had hung up. But he hadn't. Harold could hear breathing. Shallow. Quick. I have the documentation ready to file. Bank fraud. Unauthorized transfer from a joint account. Elder financial abuse, if Barbara advises me to pursue it under that statute. I haven't filed yet. That's not mercy. That's timing. He let that sit. Here's what's going to happen. The house will be sold. I'll manage the sale through Barbara. From the proceeds, Owen will receive $50,000. He earned it. You will receive $50,000. Not because you deserve it. Because your mother would have wanted me to give you one more chance to be the kind of man she hoped you'd become. The rest goes to me. And you will not contact me about the cabin, the accounts, or the will. If you do, if you challenge any of this, if you call Barbara, if you send Pamela to knock on my door, I will file the fraud report. Every page. Every IP address. Every dollar. He stopped talking. Derek said, eventually, in a voice Harold described as smaller than I've ever heard from him, "Dad, Harold said, I'm not finished. You measured the living room 4 days after your mother's funeral. You moved her chair. You moved the chair she sat in every night for 20 years, and you put a tape measure where she used to put her feet. I want you to sit with that. Not today. Not this year. But at some point, I want you to understand what that looked like to a man who had just buried the only person who ever thought to hide a key for him." He hung up. The house sold in June. $398,000. Barbara handled the transaction. Owen received his $50,000. Derek received his $50,000. The fraud report was never filed. Harold kept his word. Derek did not call to say thank you. He did not visit Tobermory. Pamela sent one email to Barbara's office asking whether the cabin could be reviewed as part of the broader estate. Barbara responded with a single paragraph citing the specific clause in Margaret's updated will and the legal doctrine of specific bequest. Pamela did not write back. Owen visits Harold every few weeks. He brings groceries, fixes what needs fixing, and sits on the porch with Harold watching the bay. Harold told me Owen is the closest thing he has to a son now, and that he doesn't say that to punish Derek, he says it because it's true. Harold is 72. He wakes up early. He makes coffee in a percolator Margaret bought at a yard sale in 1994. He sits in the blue chair by the window. Some mornings the bay is flat and silver. Some mornings it's rough and gray. He watches it either way. He told me he talks to Margaret sometimes. Not out loud. Just in his head. He tells her about the birds. About the roof repair. About Owen's new girlfriend. About the way the light comes through the trees in October. And sometimes, he tells her she was right. About the cabin. About the distance. About knowing when to hide a key and when to change the locks. She was right about everything. This has been Christopher. If this one stayed with you, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.